Hello, and welcome to the Intergenerational Solidarity Series, a podcast brought to you by Civic Voice, Inuka Kenya ni Sisi, and The Elephant. I'm Darius Okola, here with episode 4, about a national dissent that has come to collectively be known as the Gen Z protests. Joining me today is Atsango Chesoni. Atsango Chesoni is a Kenyan lawyer, a human rights advocate, and a former executive director of Kenya Human Rights Commission. She was also the former deputy chairperson of the committee of experts that finalized Kenya's 2010 constitution. Karibu sana.
Thank you very much, Darius, and thank you to Civic Voice for inviting me.
Glad to have you here. Yeah. I mean, just getting started on this, isn't it amazing you carried your copy of the constitution, which is a document that you midwifed. And looking at the moment you are in right now, there are so many aspects of going on in the society in terms of dissent, in terms of voices out there. Would you say this constitutes a constitutional moment?
I don't know whether or not it's a constitutional moment. I actually think I would describe more last year, the time when we were having the protests, especially the time when Parliament was breached, as having been a constitutional moment. Because in that moment, the citizens said that they were so displeased with their representatives that they felt that they needed to express themselves and remind their representatives that Parliament belonged to them. So I'm not so sure that I would say now is, but definitely to me, that moment last year was.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it fits within a long line of agitation in this country. It's not the first time the young people have risen, and you're privy to that long history of agitation across the country. Mm-hmm. What are some of the interesting aspects that you see coming out now that would relate to when you were in the streets, during the second liberation?
I think the one thing both have in common is the activism of young people, and young people rising up and speaking out. I think if you go even before my generation and you look at what happened during the Kenya period, for example, a lot of the figures that were either arrested and detained or whose lives were radically altered by what was happening were young people, and the universities tended to be a target. So I think even if you look across the globe, usually it is the young people in a society that rise up when that community feels that there is a need for change, for radical change. It's usually the youth. And this is why, if you look at the 1980s and 1990s, very often the regimes of the day were focused on controlling spaces that are dominated by the youth. In those times, it was the universities. The difference that I see with Gen Z is that this seemed to be cross-cutting. It seemed to be across the country. We saw young people rising up regardless of their class and working with each other, regardless of the region or their class differences. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I see a difference. It tended to be people, usually you'd either find people who were in university, or with the demonstrations in the late 1990s around the constitutional reform movement, a lot of the people that you saw and that tended to be the face, it tended to be working class young men, poor and working class young men who you'd see in the demonstrations. We were there as women. I personally participated in those demonstrations, but a lot of the face tended to be that constituency, and usually they would have been mobilized by particular political leaders. Uh-huh. Yeah.
Which is interesting. You mentioned of the aspect of gender. One of the interesting elements that came up last year on January 27th of 2024, we had a femicide march and it had interesting aspects in terms of its mobilization. There weren't many politicians. In fact, no one particularly wanted politicians involved. It was a lot of young women in there, and it pretty much was the first major agitation protest in the country, in what we can describe as the biggest protest here in the country. And there are many parallels that have been drawn to that. Just touching on the gender aspect of this kind of agitation, given that it looks different, it's younger people, but with cross-cutting sort of social appeal. What are you hearing these young ladies say? And what have you seen evolve in terms of participation of women in this, both in terms of the optics, which wasn't as, as good as we're seeing now?
So I would say, with respect to forms of gender-based violence, women have organized quite a bit. Let's not forget the mothers who, when at Uhuru Park, at Freedom Corner, who even stripped in honor of their sons, find they were not demonstrating on the basis of a gender-specific form of violation, but the strategy they used was gender-specific. And then we move forward into the 1990s, when the Coalition on Violence Against Women was set up, and COVAO initiated the 16 Days of Activism Against Women, and we had the first marches specifically against domestic violence. It was called Breaking the Silence. So we have had situations where, in respect of gender-based violence, women have stood up, and different generations of women have marched to protest those forms of violence. Again, my dress, my choice. Yeah. Again, it was women speaking up against gender-based violence. What I would say was different last year is that I think the proximity of that event with the general displeasure and anger that was rising in the public with respect to particularly our economic conditions and the situation in the country meant that I guess that march probably was a forerunner of what was to come. And it also meant that the women of the Gen Z generation are more visible in terms of their activism and played a bigger leadership role, I think, cross-cutting again with respect to those demonstrations. Their presence was it could not be denied. Women have again always participated in our liberation struggles. Somehow when it comes to documenting them, we're written out. Right from the beginning. I don't know if many Kenyans realize that Siotune was the one who predicted the coming of the white man and the colonial forces. That whole prophecy about the snake that would come, that would belch smoke, it was made by a woman. Siotune, yeah. Exactly. Where Siokimau is now. Yeah. She was a seer. I don't know about your generation, but when my generation was taught that history, it was very much history. She was spoken about in such a way that you would have thought it was a man. People like Menyazi Wamenza, Mekatilili, again, we were not taught about her in school. So women have always been there. It's just that I think the level of participation this time, it wasn't like some small group of women. They were visibly present. They were visibly playing roles at the forefront. They were visibly playing leadership roles.
Yeah. So, can we say with the participation vis-a-vis the erasure that came with it over history, but now you're seeing participation met with appreciation. Can we say with this new dynamic we have unlocked and not necessarily a new constituent, but a new way of both understanding protests, but also actually taking into account the contribution that they're making. Because I look at last year's entire list, and there were so many young women, very impressive, very articulate, standing up, bringing in perspectives that would have easily been missed, because it's very easy when we navigate this kind of a space as men, as young men, as men from a certain particular social perspective. It's very hard to be able to give that kind of a full flavor to this kind of national agitation. Can you say this kind of appreciation opens up even bigger doors for not just contribution, but also in terms of the input that keeps it sustaining, because it's a year later and it's not anywhere close to dying down?
What I would say is that I think the beauty of it, of last year's demonstration, is that we had a critical mass of women. And when you have a critical mass, it makes it possible for you to make demands. Your presence cannot be denied. Yeah. And so that's the aspect to it that I think will, I hope, yield opportunities for this generation of women that haven't been there before. Usually, we haven't had the sheer force of numbers behind us enough to make the more established political actors sit up and say, we have to respond to this constituency's needs. I think right now, if this generation is able to galvanize it, they have a form of negotiating power that I don't think any other generation of women in this country, at least in the last century, has had. Yeah, that's what I think they have, that, the rest of us didn't.
Okay. And what's interesting about it, and maybe you could allude to it also partly in terms of how it looked like in the 90s and in student politics. You can almost say where 2 or 3 Kenyans are gathered, there's literally a chant, social spaces are taking on political dimension. Is this our evolution into a hyper-vigilant, and very active kind of a public sphere? And how crucial is it? And I mean, just your general sense of how pretty much every social space, every event, even musical events, sports events, have all taken on this kind of political dimension. But what's your sense of this kind of a political society?
I think Kenyans, to themselves, I think Kenyans think this is new. But if you listen to other people, including our neighbors, talking about Kenyans, we're notorious for our love of politics. So I think in a sense, that's not new, maybe. I do think there's a period after we got the new constitution where I don't know whether people were tired. It's like people kind of like went to sleep for like about a decade, possibly a decade and a half there. So maybe also that's why it seems new, because I think there's a point where people really relaxed. If it's a mark of hypervigilance, I actually think that's a good thing. There's it's actually a cliche now that the price of freedom is vigilance. I think when societies go to sleep or seem to have gone to sleep, those who have had the privilege to be in positions of power begin to take that society for granted. I think this is a characteristic of politics. I think if you are going to ensure that you have accountable leadership, then you need a public that leaders understand will be there, will be holding their feet to the fire constantly. So for me, that's a good thing. I actually think it's probably the best thing. And if I can relate to the Constitution, part of what was very important about the Constitution was about making law and governance accessible to the people. And so for me, it's a very important aspect of the growth of our democracy. I think the moment we allow ourselves to stop paying attention, I think then that will be dangerous for us as a society.
Yeah. One of the interesting elements that comes out of that is the fact that as a country, we've always, or at least in many instances, had to deal with a statecraft that is built and sustained by elite bargains. Mm-hmm. Anytime they feel threatened, they close ranks. Last year, we saw them close ranks, mm-hmm. but it seems not to be effective. Can we say we are fairly close to the end of that kind of a dynamic? Or
I don't know. I think our political elite are very wily. So for me, mm-hmm. I can't call it yet.
Okay.
I don't feel that I personally can call it yet. And this is why I was saying that it's very important for people to stay vigilant. Mm-hmm. I don't think people should let themselves... I think we have to agree as Kenyans, what are the values and the principles mm-hmm. that we hold dear and that we think are important for us to have in place and respected and guarded with our lives mm-hmm. in order for us all to have an equal chance at mm-hmm. a life of good quality.
Yeah.
I think it becomes very dangerous when the responsibility for ensuring that that happens is vested in one or two individuals mm-hmm. or in a particular sector. One of the biggest challenges and why I think we've continued to have certain battles is because historically we tended to vest responsibility mm-hmm. in either individuals mm-hmm. or some particular sector.
Yeah.
And then what would happen is that either the individuals would get co-opted mm-hmm. or that sector will get targeted. When we all consider it our responsibility to make sure that we all enjoy a certain quality of life, it then becomes a norm that anybody who is aspiring towards a leadership position understands that they have to respect. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you know what's interesting about our constitutional document, of which you pretty much primary in trying to bring the views of Kenyans together and give that sense of this is what truly represents us. 15 years into it, basically, we've watched a lot of trying to observe it in breach than in trying to follow it through, especially from our elite mm-hmm. spaces. And looking at this moment, we still have many elements of the kind of ideas they're proposing that literally are trying to breach this document. Will its provisions hold? And what recourse do Kenyans have at this point, both in terms of the legal elements, but also out here, to be able to hold back on this onslaught? Do you think we have enough of a formidable moment to be able to hold back what they're trying?
I think, you see, the Constitution was birthed in spite of the political elite. They never wanted it. Mm-hmm. Even those of us who served in the committee of experts and the previous bodies, mm-hmm. you know, because I also was part of the National Constitutional Conference at Bomas and had been part of the constitutional reform movement. We always knew that the powers that be, none of the regimes that we had in place during the time that this constitution evolved and was finally promulgated wanted it. None of them. Mm-hmm. I don't think Kenyans should ever delude themselves about that. And so, given that it was a constitution that the people gave to themselves, if we wanted to survive, mm-hmm. and constitutions only live through the people, it's not enough to have it on paper. The people have to live that spirit and demand mm-hmm. of those who have been privileged to hold office, be it in the judiciary, be it in the executive, be it in the legislature, be it in the constitutional commissions and the various institutions that we've put in place. We have to demand that they do what they're supposed to do. Mm-hmm. We will continue to face this resistance because the kind of power that our leaders were able to wield under the old constitutional order is a kind of power that you've never seen anywhere in the world. Feroz Novraji used to describe it, he used to describe the Kenyan presidency under the old constitutional order as being the most powerful office of its kind in the world. It combined the powers of the British monarch with the powers of the American president and the prime minister. Yeah. And so, powerful. Yeah, and you need to remember you're dealing with a generation of people who lived through that era. And so they will always want to reach back. You know, for young people, you may never have known what it's like. I, as a child, there's a point in time where we would have to whisper about certain things. We had a culture of silence in this country. And it was born out of real fear, out of the fact that people could be arrested and not even have the opportunity to be tried and sent away for years. And, you know, I know you've had the privilege of speaking to some of those people. And so today, for me, because I've had the privilege of living through a time when we have fought for our rights and been able to speak, sometimes I think about, I remember when I first came back home from university, we were having a meeting. And there was somebody who had been involved with the Release Political Prisoners Pressure Group, RPPG, who had worked with the mothers at Freedom Corner, who had had to go into exile. And so she had just come back home. And she came into our meeting and she was looking around and she's like, hey, are you guys sure you can say these things and not have to worry? And it wasn't like we were doing anything particularly radical. I don't even remember what we were doing, to be honest, at this point in time, that had her worried. But being somebody who was about 10 years older than me, for her generation, even what we were doing was, you know, oh my God, I can't believe you can do this. And I can't compare those moments to now. You know, I'm talking about a situation where, for example, we had friends who were doing work in theater for development. And I used to go to a little theater on Mufangano Street, and we were rehearsing for a play. And then we saw soldiers coming in. Everybody panicked. We were like, oh goodness, this year's festival is going to be shut down. And then it turned out they were coming because some of the guys that were doing the work on Theatre for Development were also doing work on HIV. And they had been doing some work with the soldiers. So it turned out these guys had been sent to pick up props. But there was a moment, and nobody had to say anything. We all, because the scale and level of repression was that high. So we all just knew, even the less conscious people, that we might be shut down. And that year, the opening play was going to be Kongi's Harvest by Wole Soyinka. Again, a play which to people today might not seem to be radical, but at that time may have been considered radical. And so to go from that to a society where people, freedom of expression is completely taken for granted. It's a very different world.
I see them try to open up an interesting sort of flank when it comes to dealing with young people. We've had the threats about, internet shutdown. We've had this, them trying to change the Data Privacy Act to expand and give it broad powers that are even in breach of other provisions. So these elites, in a sense, will always be one step away from trying to take everything away from us. And I think one of the interesting elements that stands out for me is when you mentioned the person in question was just 10 years ahead of you. And I mean, within 10 years, a lot changes, but then within those 10 years also, you still have this kind of significant onslaught from these politicians and the elites in general. And just in light of that, where do you think this kind of an evolving hypervigilant society will go? I mean, just borrowing from history and from the examples around the world and around here, within the continent, where does this go? How does this evolve from here?
I think we cannot stop. This is not the struggle of just one generation. And I must commend Civic Voice for choosing to have an intergenerational dialogue. I think it's very important. I think we need to understand there are many things which, as a young person, I thought we would have consolidated by now. I never thought I would see the kind of clawbacks. Mm-hmm. So for me, the lesson, having been somebody who was active as a younger person, is that we can't stop. That hypervigilance is critical. Mm-hmm. I would say keep working, be open to mentoring and being mentored. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because also mentoring is a two-way street. There's innovations around organizing that Gen Z have brought to the table. Mm-hmm. And there's things which they were able to pressure for that the rest of us weren't necessarily. Mm-hmm. and would not have been able to, mm-hmm. because you're also living in a different time. You have tools that we didn't, but you also face challenges that we didn't. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so it's important to always pass the torch on, mm-hmm. for us to always ensure that at any point in time, we are guarding those freedoms jealously. And we're making sure that our children mm-hmm. understand the importance of guarding those freedoms jealously. Yeah. Yeah.
Which is interesting, and then just to take you a bit further back, and which is like sort of the other side of this conversation, which is, in a sense, we're looking at the kind of elite bargain that didn't yield the kind of result it has always done historically, with the handshakes and the mergers and the grand national this, mm-hmm. and the unity that, and all these unity calls that our elites tend to make. For the first time, it's not holding up. It doesn't have that stickability factor in terms of rallying their constituent bases to the respective corners they like to. What are the options then? What are they likely to do? How have they always reacted when they find themselves in a space where the mechanics are not yielding the kind of results they want out of the public?
Never underestimate the power of greed. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's why I say it, just stay vigilant. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think people will take what they can.
Sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. We have to say no. Yeah. Whatever they can get away with, they will take it. I remember after the post-election violence, mm-hmm. In 2008, literally, there were people who had not been willing to do anything in terms of the negotiation table. When that Annan mm-hmm. mediation, the mediation by the late Kofi Annan and the late Benjamin Mkapa and Graca Machel happened, and the National Accord. There were people who literally, as soon as the National Accord went through and there'd been that handshaking, suddenly were popping out of the woodwork. And suddenly were very concerned. And then there's people who had done a lot of work behind the scenes to make sure that there was a peaceful resolution, mm-hmm. who were just shoved out of the way and who you never hear about, mm-hmm. and who, if one hadn't had the privilege of being in that historical moment, would probably never know mm-hmm. that, maybe if this particular person hadn't done what they did, we might not have had the opportunity of a peaceful resolution. Mm-hmm. And so, and again, I can tell you definitely with the Constitution, mm-hmm. there was a similar dynamic, And so, as cynical as it may sound, mm-hmm. I think we just have to stay vigilant. Mm-hmm. We have to insist that we want a country where everybody has equal opportunity to go to school, everybody has a roof over their head, everybody has food of a certain quality, everybody has access to basic health care, all those things that are that are contained in the Bill of Rights, that all those things are available to every single person in this country.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the moment we decide that it's okay to leave some people behind, one day it will be you.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are politicians who right now didn't think that they would be affected, and who maybe on the 1st of January 2024 held a very different position from what they hold right now, and have ended up having to deal with the actual repercussions of the way we were running things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just as we close, one of the interesting elements that's emerging out of this whole sort of Gen Z revolution, as we call it, is new voices, new leaders, new ideas. That one of the elements you're seeing is they haven't found a home yet, in terms of platforms and spaces. So what are the possibilities for some of these younger leaders? Where do they go from here? Because one of the things you're seeing is some of them get out here because we have no sort of a clear path to follow in terms of their political progression. Then it becomes easy for them to be co-opted back into the patronage network infrastructure. What are the possibilities for these young ones who are not trying to get into that space within this sort of fluid moment?
I think that's where the amorphousness of Gen Z becomes very challenging, because I think there will have to be some way in which you organize yourselves and understand that co-option is one of the oldest games, and it always happens. And new ways of thinking is very threatening for those political elites. One of the things that drives them, and to me that was very clear in terms of how they coalesced and suddenly were in agreement with each other. I think the very newness of what was happening was a threat to them. So you need to understand that they will try to contain you and mold you into something they're more used to dealing with. Yeah. That newness is problematic for them. And so if we believe that this new way of organizing is good for us as a society, then we have to protect it, because it's like a baby. And so that old way of doing things will definitely try to crush it. With the Constitution, they were very organized. They had enough time to do it. Yeah. And so they positioned themselves. They figured out how they were going to contain us. I think the spontaneity of Gen Z was a strength. I don't know that it was an intentional strength, but it was a strength. Yeah, it was unpredictable. Yeah. And so that helped. And so there has to be a way to figure out how to use organizing and structure in a way that doesn't suffocate you, but enables sustainability.
Okay.
I don't know how else to put it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. There's within this new contestation between the old patronage network and whatever is emerging out of last year, especially this new infrastructure. One hopes that within that contestation, they'll be able to hold their ground. But also, number two, begin to find spaces for that kind of progression, because as dynamics evolve, also they should be able to find those kinds of structures that then provide the kind of longevity and a formidable framework to push back. Because clearly we are looking at this year and we're already seeing echoes of last year in terms of people's willingness to stand up and agitate, and the fact that it's gone into the society, into every facet, including the social elements, makes it a very interesting development.
Yeah. And they will try to wear you down. because you're dealing with people that do have resources, and so I'm more entrenched. Yeah.
All right. Atsango Chesoni, always a pleasure.
It's a pleasure, Darius, and thank you very much.
You're welcome.